The sunlight broke lazily over the rooftops of a small Ohio suburb, casting long golden streaks across the quiet neighborhood. James Whitaker sat at his worn oak kitchen table, sipping from a chipped mug that read, "Best Dad, 1989." Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and hit the bell icon. The mug had been a Father's Day gift from his late wife decades ago, and though the paint was faded and the handle cracked, he refused to replace it. It was the one piece of her that always made breakfast feel complete. At 66, James's life had narrowed into a predictable routine. He woke at 6 every morning, brewed his coffee, flipped through the Cleveland Plain Dealer, and sometimes took a slow walk around the block before settling into small chores. His days were quiet, shaped by years of habit and the kind of solitude that comes when your family no longer depends on you. His wife, Margaret, had died of breast cancer 15 years earlier, and his only child, Allison, had long since built a life of her own, or at least that's what he believed. Allison had always been his pride, his soft spot. He'd worked 30 years at a tire manufacturing plant, breaking his back on overtime shifts so he could afford her tuition at Ohio State University. He never regretted it. Not when he watched her walk across the graduation stage in her crimson robe, beaming, her diploma clutched like a prize. He thought those sacrifices had secured her future, but Allison's choices after college had surprised him. Instead of pursuing a stable career, she'd married Kyle, a man James never trusted. Kyle Anderson was slick-talking, quick to smile, always full of big plans. He went from one business scheme to another, selling cars, flipping houses, starting an online sports betting app that barely lasted 3 months. James tried to give him the benefit of the doubt for Allison's sake, but deep down he always saw Kyle as what he was, a drifter hungry for shortcuts. Still, Allison insisted she loved him, and James, reluctantly, kept his mouth shut. What mattered most, he told himself, was her happiness. That Friday morning in late November, the crisp air carried hints of winter. James had just buttered his toast when he heard the doorbell. Strange, he thought. Visitors rarely came this early. Peering through the window, he saw Allison's familiar figure standing on the porch, bundled in a gray coat. Beside her was Kyle, hands shoved in his pockets, smirk already curling across his face. James frowned but opened the door. "Morning, this is a surprise." Allison stepped forward, her smile wide but forced. "Dad, we thought we'd stop by for breakfast. We brought donuts from Benny's." She held up a pink bakery box as if it were a peace offering. James forced a smile, though he felt a twist of unease. They hadn't visited in weeks. Usually Allison called ahead. Something about their unannounced arrival scratched at his instincts. Still, he waved them in. "Come on then, coffee's hot." Inside, the kitchen filled quickly with their presence. Kyle leaned casually against the counter, like he owned the place, while Allison placed the donut box on the table. Her movements were tight, almost rehearsed. James watched them over the rim of his mug, a heaviness stirring in his gut. Then came the words that changed everything. "Dad," Allison said softly, pulling a large envelope from her purse. James set his mug down slowly. What kind of surprise? Her fingers trembled as she slid the envelope across the table. "Open it, please." The envelope was thick, stamped with the letterhead of a downtown law firm James didn't recognize. He tore it open, confused, and pulled out a stack of documents. At first glance, they looked like loan agreements, credit statements, casino receipts. His name appeared at the top of every page. As his eyes darted across the numbers, his chest tightened. $400,000. That was the total debt listed across multiple accounts, all in his name. "What the hell is this?" he demanded, his voice sharper than he intended. Allison bit her lip, tears gathering in her eyes. "Dad, they're your debts. We found them while helping you organize your paperwork last month. Do you remember?" James's hands shook as he spread the papers wider. Loan contracts from casinos in Detroit and Pittsburgh, places he'd never even visited. Credit card applications signed in handwriting that looked terrifyingly like his own. It was his signature, down to the loop of his J and the uneven slope of his W. "I didn't sign these," he said firmly, his voice low and cold. "This is fraud." Kyle stepped in smoothly, his tone condescending. "Come on, James. The signatures are yours. Anyone can see that. Memory isn't what it used to be, right?" "Maybe you've forgotten." James glared at him. "I may be old, but I'm not senile. I've never gambled a day in my life." Allison reached across the table, her hand trembling. "Dad, please, we need to fix this together. These debts have to be paid by Monday, or we'll all lose everything. The house, the cars, everything." James shoved her hand away. "Don't you dare. Don't you dare try to make this my fault." Kyle's smirk vanished, replaced by a hard edge. He leaned closer, his voice a growl. "Whether you admit it or not, those debts are in your name. If they're not paid, the collectors will take this house. And you know what? Maybe that's for the best. Allison and I can deal with it. You clearly can't." James felt the walls closing in. His daughter, his only child, stood shoulder to shoulder with this man, united in betrayal. The girl he'd raised alone, the girl he'd carried on his shoulders at the county fair, now looked at him with watery eyes, begging him to accept responsibility for something he hadn't done. "This isn't over," James said, rising from the table. His voice trembled, not with fear, but with rage. "Not by a long shot." Allison's tears turned to anger. "You're selfish. You've always been selfish." Her hand darted toward the coffee pot, and before James could react, scalding liquid flew across the table, soaking into his flannel shirt. The pain was instant, searing across his chest. He gasped, stumbling backward, clutching at the fabric. Allison stood frozen, the empty pot dangling from her hand. Kyle, however, looked almost satisfied. "Get out, old man," Kyle said coldly. "This is our house now. Pack whatever you can and leave." Through the haze of burning skin, James straightened. "This house is mine. I worked for it, paid for it, built every piece of my life inside these walls. You can't take that." Kyle stepped forward, his breath hot with cigarette smoke. "By Monday, the creditors will own it, unless you pay. 5 minutes, James. Get your things, then you're gone." James looked at Allison one last time, searching her face for the little girl he'd once known. But she wouldn't meet his eyes. The betrayal was complete. He turned, chest burning, and walked down the hall towards his bedroom. Each step felt heavier than the last. He could hear their voices behind him, low and hurried, plotting their next move. But as he closed his bedroom door, James felt something shift inside him. They thought they'd broken him, driven him out of his own home. They thought he'd roll over and accept defeat. They had no idea what he was capable of. This wasn't the end. This was the beginning. James closed his bedroom door softly, his breath ragged, chest throbbing where the boiling coffee had seared his skin. He peeled the flannel shirt off slowly, wincing as the damp fabric clung to his burned flesh. In the mirror above his dresser, he saw an old man staring back, red, blistered patches across his torso, eyes clouded with disbelief. But beneath the pain, something else flickered. Fury. He moved deliberately, ignoring the sting as he pulled a clean cotton shirt from the drawer. His hands were steady as he buttoned it over the burns. Steady because he knew what had just happened wasn't the end of his story. They had underestimated him, his daughter, his scheming son-in-law. They thought they'd cornered him into submission. But James Whitaker wasn't a man who gave in. 30 years in the factory had hardened him, not broken him. He'd worked 12-hour shifts on busted knees, breathing in tire dust, saving every dime so Allison could have a better life. And now, she threw hot coffee at him, sided with a fraud, tried to rob him of his home? Fine. If they wanted a war, they'll get one. He yanked his old leather suitcase from the closet shelf and threw in 3 changes of clothes, his blood pressure medication, and a small lockbox he kept hidden beneath a stack of sweaters. Inside were birth certificates, his house deed, insurance papers, and an updated will. Proof of his ownership. Proof of who he was. The voices outside his door grew louder. Kyle's low, arrogant tone. Allison's sharper, panicked replies. "We need to move fast," Kyle was saying. "He'll come around, he always does," Allison whispered. James's jaw clenched. Not this time. He slipped his wallet and car keys into his pocket, grabbed the suitcase, and opened the bedroom window quietly. The November air rushed in, icy against his burned chest, but refreshing compared to the suffocating betrayal inside. He swung the suitcase over the sill, climbed out slowly, and dropped down into the frosty backyard grass. For a moment he stood there, his breath visible in the cold, staring up at the house he'd lived in for 30 years. He could see shadows moving across the kitchen blinds, his daughter and her husband, settling in like predators who thought the hunt was finished. James turned away, walking toward the wooden fence at the edge of his yard. His neighbor, Frank Dalton, had lived next door for nearly 20 years. A retired history teacher, Frank was one of the few people James still trusted. They'd shared beers in the backyard, traded lawnmowers when one broke, and spent countless summer evenings debating the Cleveland Guardians' chances of ever winning a World Series again. Frank's kitchen light glowed warmly. James trudged across the frost-crusted grass and rapped on the back door. Moments later, Frank appeared in a robe, his eyebrows lifting in surprise when he saw James clutching a suitcase, his shirt collar damp and reddened from burns. "Jesus, Jim, what happened?" Frank opened the door wide, motioning him in. James stepped into the cozy kitchen, the smell of bacon lingering in the air. For the first time that morning, he allowed himself to breathe. "I need a favor," he said hoarsely, "and I've got a story to tell you, one you won't believe." They sat at Frank's small kitchen table, a pot of fresh coffee steaming between them. James chuckled darkly at the irony. This cup symbolized comfort, not violence. He cradled it in both hands, letting the warmth soothe his shaking fingers. Frank listened silently as James unraveled the morning's events. The envelope, the $400,000 debt, the forged signatures, Allison's tears that turned to rage, and finally the scalding attack. When James pulled back his shirt collar to show the angry red burns across his chest, Frank's expression hardened. "That's not family drama, Jim," he said quietly. "That's assault. That's fraud. They're criminals." James's throat tightened. "She's still my daughter." "No," Frank said firmly, leaning forward. "Your daughter died the moment she sided with that leech to steal your life. The woman in your kitchen right now is a stranger with your daughter's face." James looked down at his coffee, the steam blurring his vision. He wanted to argue, to defend Allison, but deep down he knew Frank was right. "She used to be so good," James murmured. "When she was little, she'd sit on my shoulders at the fair. She loved reading, like her mom. Margaret would have—" His voice broke. He couldn't finish. Frank placed a steady hand on his arm. "Jim, you've done everything for her, more than most fathers would. But you can't let them destroy you. You need to fight back." James looked up, his jaw tightening. "Oh, I will." Over the next hour, James confessed things he hadn't admitted even to himself. How Allison and Kyle had slowly wormed into his life over the past 4 years. How they'd first asked to stay just 1 month after Kyle lost another job, and how that 1 month had stretched into years. How Kyle had slowly taken over his garage, reorganized his tools, eaten his food without asking, borrowed his car, even held poker nights that left the living room reeking of cigar smoke. And how Allison had always defended him. "He's just trying to help, Dad. Don't be so stubborn." Then there was the food truck scam,
$15,000 of James's savings gone, supposedly an investment in Kyle's big idea. 3 weeks later, the truck was sold, the money vanished, and Kyle called it protecting Jim from further losses. Frank listened, shaking his head in disbelief. They've been setting you up for years, grooming you to doubt yourself, to depend on them, to hand over control. James's stomach twisted as he realized the truth. He'd been so desperate to keep Allison close, to believe in her happiness, that he'd ignored every red flag. But this morning, he said bitterly, they crossed a line. I won't let them win. James pulled out his phone and opened the gallery. Before leaving the house, he'd quickly snapped photos of the debt documents spread across the kitchen table. The signatures, the casino markers, the payment schedules, all damning evidence. Frank leaned closer, his teacher's mind working methodically. This is identity theft, forgery, extortion, and what Allison did, that's domestic battery. You've got more than enough to put them behind bars. James's thumb hovered over the screen. I still can't believe she did it. My little girl. Wake up, Jim. Frank's voice was sharp but compassionate. If you don't call the police, they'll bury you alive in this mess. They'll take your house, your pension, everything. James exhaled slowly. You're right. God help me, but you're right. The old landline on Frank's wall looked out of place in the modern kitchen, but at that moment it felt like a lifeline. James stared at it, his chest heavy. Dial 911, Frank urged. Do it now, before they destroy the evidence. James hesitated.
His hands trembled as he picked up the receiver. If I do this, Allison could go to jail. And if you don't, she'll ruin you, maybe worse. James swallowed hard. The memory of scalding coffee searing his skin flared again, the pain still fresh. She'd already tried to hurt him. What would stop her next time? He dialed. 2 rings, then a calm voice. 911, what's your emergency? James' voice was steady now. I need to report a domestic assault and fraud. My daughter and her husband attacked me in my own home. He gave his address, described his injuries, explained the forged documents. The dispatcher promised officers would arrive within 20 minutes. When he hung up, James set the receiver back in its cradle, his hands finally still. How do you feel? Frank asked quietly. Like I just burned the last bridge I had, James admitted. But it was the right thing to do. Frank nodded. Sometimes justice costs us what we thought we couldn't lose. But in the end, you'll gain your freedom back. They sat together in tense silence as the grandfather clock ticked toward 9. James's suitcase sat by the door, a symbol of how quickly his life had been upended. Through the window, he could see his house, where Allison and Kyle still moved about as if they owned it. Do you think they'll run? Frank asked. James shook his head. No, they still think they've won. They think I'm too weak to fight back. They have no idea what's coming. Moments later, headlights swept across the driveway. A black and white patrol car rolled up quietly, followed by a second. 2 officers stepped out, one older woman with silver streaks in her hair, the other a younger man scanning the yard with sharp eyes. Frank rose, straightening his robe. Time to get justice, Jim. James stood too, squaring his shoulders despite the ache of his burns. For the first time all morning, he felt strong. The officers approached, and James stepped forward to meet them. My name is James Whitaker, he said firmly. Thank you for coming. I'm ready to tell you everything. The older officer introduced herself as Sergeant Linda Myers. Her partner, Officer Patrick O'Neill, carried a small notepad and camera. Both immediately noticed the burns visible above James's collar. Sir, we'll need to document your injuries, Myers said gently. James unbuttoned his shirt enough to reveal the raw, blistering patches across his chest. O'Neill snapped photos, while Myers asked careful, methodical questions. Who attacked you? My daughter, Allison Anderson, James answered, his voice firm.
She threw hot coffee on me when I refused to sign papers for a $400,000 debt. Her husband, Kyle, threatened me and told me to leave my own house. O'Neill's pen scratched quickly across the notepad. And the debt documents? James gestured toward his house. They're on my kitchen table, forged every last one. I've got photos on my phone, too. Frank interjected. He also has burns from the assault, and he's got proof Kyle's been gambling under his name. This isn't just family drama, Sergeant. It's fraud and identity theft. Myers nodded gravely. We'll secure the evidence. Mr. Whitaker, will you walk us over and point out the documents? James inhaled sharply. Walking back into that house felt like stepping into a lion's den. But he knew it had to be done. Let's go, he said, his voice steady. Crossing the yard with 2 police officers at his side gave James a strange mix of dread and empowerment. He could almost feel Allison and Kyle's eyes on him through the blinds. O'Neill knocked firmly on the door. Cleveland Police Department, open up. There was a scramble inside, then Allison's muffled voice. Just a minute. When the door opened, Allison's face drained of color at the sight of the uniforms. Kyle appeared behind her, his expression shifting from irritation to thinly veiled calculation. Allison Anderson? Myers stepped forward. We need to speak with you regarding an incident reported this morning. I, I don't know what you mean, Allison stammered. O'Neill separated the two quickly. Kyle was directed toward the lawn, while Allison was escorted into the living room. James watched from the porch as the officers moved with calm efficiency, asserting control. Inside, the kitchen still bore signs of the confrontation. Coffee stains across the table, the shattered remains of James's mug on the floor. The forged debt papers were scattered where he had left them, thick with legal jargon and damning signatures.
O'Neill photographed everything before carefully collecting the documents. These will go straight to evidence. Meanwhile, Myers spoke firmly in the living room. Allison Anderson, you are under investigation for domestic battery and fraud. You'll have a chance to explain yourself at the station. I didn't mean to hurt him, Allison cried. It was an accident. I just lost control. From the lawn, Kyle's angry voice carried. This is harassment. He's lying. The old man signed those papers himself. James stood silently, watching the house he loved fill with law enforcement. His home had become a crime scene, but for the first time in years, he felt protected. Within 20 minutes, backup arrived, a transport van ready to take the suspects into custody. Sergeant Myers returned to James. Based on the evidence and your statement, we have probable cause. Both Allison and Kyle will be arrested tonight. James nodded slowly. He wanted to cry, wanted to scream, but instead he whispered, "Do what you have to do." From the front window, he saw O'Neill snap handcuffs onto Allison's wrists. She sobbed, mascara streaking down her face. Myers read her rights in a firm, clear voice. You have the right to remain silent. Outside, Kyle resisted until 2 officers pushed him against the squad car. His voice dripped venom. You'll regret this, Whitaker. You just killed your own daughter's life. James didn't flinch. He only said, No, Kyle, you did that yourself. Moments later, both were loaded into separate vans. The sirens stayed off, but the flashing lights reflected off the windows, casting the quiet street in shades of blue and red. Neighbors peeked through curtains, whispering. When the vehicles pulled away, silence settled again. James stood on the porch, the November air biting at his burns. Relief coursed through him, tempered by grief. They're gone, Frank murmured at his side. For now, James said, but the fight's just starting. Back in Frank's warm kitchen, James sat with a fresh bandage across his chest, courtesy of a paramedic who'd arrived after the arrests. The burns would heal, but the wounds inside him felt deeper. Frank poured 2 mugs of chamomile tea. You did the right thing, Jim. They'd have bled you dry. James nodded, staring into the steaming cup. It's just, I can't believe it came to this. My own daughter. Frank's tone softened. Blood doesn't excuse the trail, and you've got more than enough evidence to protect yourself now. James rubbed his temples. But evidence won't stop the shame. People will talk. Neighbors will judge. Allison will say I ruined her life. Let them talk, Frank said firmly. The truth is on your side, and I'll stand with you. James met his friend's eyes, gratitude flickering there. You've done more for me today than anyone else in years. The next morning, James returned to Frank's kitchen with a notebook and determination. Sleep had been shallow, his dreams plagued by Allison's face shifting from little girl to criminal. But when he woke, the fire in his gut burned brighter than the grief. Frank, he said, dropping into a chair, I want to know everything. I want to know exactly how deep Kyle's mess goes. Frank grinned slightly. Good, because I already started digging. From a manila folder on the counter, he pulled out printouts, records from county court websites, local news clippings, even public bankruptcy filings. Frank, a retired teacher with a love for research, had clearly been busy. Here, he said, sliding a document across the table. Kyle Anderson was arrested last year for writing fraudulent checks. Case is still pending. Trial scheduled next month. He's out on bail. James scanned the paper, his heart pounding. And Allison knew? Frank nodded grimly. She had to. There's more. Gambling sites, credit card debts, loan sharks. The man owes close to 300 grand before interest. That's where your supposed $400,000 debt came from. James clenched his fists. He tried to dump it all on me. And Allison helped him, Frank reminded gently. James's chest tightened. He wanted to argue, to protect the image of his daughter. But the forged signatures, the hot coffee, the coldness in her eyes, they all screamed the truth. She chose him over me, he whispered. She chose greed over love, Frank corrected. James pulled out his phone and showed Frank screenshots he'd quietly taken over the past months when Kyle had left betting sites open on the family computer. Transaction histories, account usernames, sports betting slips. Look at this, James said, scrolling. 500 here, 1,000 there, then $3,000 bets on NFL games. And when the sites cut him off, he texted guys named Tony M. and Ice Mike. Loan sharks, Frank. Frank's expression darkened. This isn't just fraud. This is dangerous. Men like that don't forgive debts. James nodded slowly. Which means Kyle's running out of time. That's why they pushed so hard yesterday. They wanted me to pay before his trial. Frank leaned back, crossing his arms. So, what's your move now? James's eyes hardened. Revenge. But the kind that doesn't land me in a cell. They wanted to steal my life. I'm going to take theirs apart, piece by piece, until they have nothing left. 2 days later, James sat across from Assistant District Attorney Rachel Porter, a sharp-eyed woman in her 40s with a reputation for handling elder abuse cases. The folder of evidence lay between them. Photos of his burns, the forged documents, screenshots of Kyle's gambling history. This is strong, Porter said, flipping through the papers. Identity theft, forgery, domestic assault, attempted extortion. We can charge both of them on multiple counts. James folded his hands tightly. I don't want them walking away with a slap on the wrist. Porter met his eyes. They won't. But you need to prepare yourself. Allison may try to claim she was manipulated by Kyle, that she's just another victim. James's jaw tightened. She wasn't manipulated when she threw hot coffee at me. She wasn't manipulated when she stood by while he threatened me. She made her choice. Porter nodded. Then we'll make sure the court sees it that way. As he left the office, James felt lighter. For the first time since Margaret's death, he wasn't just surviving. He was fighting. Back at Frank's, James began organizing his life like a general preparing for war. He met with lawyers about securing his property deed. He installed new locks in a security system at his house. He even contacted his bank to freeze his accounts against unauthorized access. Each step made him feel stronger, less like a victim, more like a man reclaiming control. One evening, as the sun dipped low, Frank poured 2 glasses of bourbon. "So, what's the end game, Jim?" James stared into the amber liquid, his reflection fractured in the glass. "They wanted me weak, desperate, broken. Instead, I'm going to watch them destroy themselves. And I'll make sure the world sees who they really are." Frank raised his glass. "To revenge done right." James clinked it firmly. "To justice." Winter tightened its grip on the Ohio neighborhood. Snow dusted the hedges and coated the mailboxes in a soft, indifferent white, as if the world outside could remain neutral while James Whitaker remade his life. For him, the chill was no deterrent. The cold sharpened his focus. With the arrests and the prosecutor's involvement, the legal machinery had started grinding. But James quickly learned the criminal process could be slow and imperfect. He needed more than charges. He needed incontrovertible proof and public visibility. He wanted the kind of revenge that used systems, banks, courts, public records against the people who'd weaponized his name. To begin, he mapped everything. A timeline of Kyle's schemes, the forged applications, the casino markers, the months of incremental theft. He printed the screenshots, asked Frank to compile court records, and organized the evidence into neat folders. The man who'd spent his life following a manufacturing checklist now treated this like a project he'd been born to finish. One clear advantage was that Kyle and Allison had been sloppy. They'd left digital trails, emails, logged-in betting accounts, text messages that tied them to purchases made using James's personal information. Kyle's habit of leaving a betting site open on shared devices had been for James a blessing in disguise. Those screenshots were a breadcrumb trail through deceit. James coordinated closely with Assistant District Attorney Rachel Porter. She advised restraint, keep certain evidence confidential to prevent witnesses from being coached, preserve chain of custody, let prosecutors build airtight cases. But she also encouraged him to secure civil remedies in parallel, freeze any suspicious transfers, file a declaratory suit to declare the debts fraudulent, and seek temporary restraining orders against Allison and Kyle to keep them from accessing the house or bank accounts. They moved fast. An emergency motion put a temporary hold on any attempts by creditors to seize the property while forensic accountants from the bank reviewed the claims. The bank discovered multiple suspicious authorizations, credit lines opened in James's name, duplicate Social Security filings, and casino credit extensions tied to accounts that used recycled personal information. When the bank flagged those accounts as fraud, a small avalanche began. Some creditors paused collection. One casino declared the markers invalid pending investigation, and a loan servicing company reversed several charges. But James knew the financial world worked on paperwork and publicity. If this remained a quiet dispute, Kyle might hide behind procedural delays and shady affidavits. So, with Rachel's cautious blessing, he agreed to a limited public approach. He gave a tightly controlled interview to a local reporter. No melodrama, just facts, evidence, that same quiet dignity he'd always worn. The headline that ran in the weekend paper read, "Local man fights $400,000 identity theft scheme. Daughter, son-in-law under investigation." It wasn't a declaration of revenge, but the story put the facts on record and put Allison and Kyle's reputations into daylight. The consequences were immediate. Allison's manager at the boutique where she worked called and put her on unpaid leave pending an internal review. People who'd once smiled in passing on the street now kept their distance. Kyle, who'd been trying to drum up investors for another get-rich-quick idea, found his calls ignored. A small, crucial humiliation. His professional contacts ran background checks and found the pending fraud investigation and his other charges. Doors closed. That same week, Frank and James visited the county courthouse to pull public filings. They found a string of civil suits against Kyle, Unpaid contractors, bounced checks, unpaid rents, names they could use as witnesses. An old contractor, Miguel Torres, testified that Kyle had promised payment for subcontracted work and then ghosted when the check bounced. Miguel provided canceled checks and bank statements showing withdrawals that matched dates of gambling spikes on James's screenshots. James also found a surprise advantage, karma at the small town level. Kyle had burned people here, neighbors, acquaintances, who were suddenly willing to speak. A bartender at the local dive admitted to lending Kyle cash for a week when he was in a jam. A former partner from a short-lived renovation business had receipts proving Kyle siphoned funds. Each testimony stitched a broader tapestry of character and motive. The prosecution consolidated the evidence into two complementary strategies: criminal charges for fraud, theft, and assault, and civil suits to recover funds and clear James's name. Rachel Porter, who had the temperament of a good prosecutor, meticulous and relentless, called in forensic accountants to quantify the stolen amounts, and she coordinated with federal investigators to examine interstate gambling transactions. The feds were interested because some of the betting platforms were offshore or registered under shell companies, which complicated collection but made misdeeds more prosecutable. In court, James sat quietly through procedural hearings while Rachel and the investigators did their work. Watching his daughter's face in the courtroom, pale, hollowed by anxiety, was a daily strain. But each time Allison looked up at him, James saw not the little girl who'd learned to ride a bike in his driveway, but a woman whose choices had culminated in this ruin. The first significant legal blow came when the county judge signed an order invalidating several of the alleged debts tied to James's identity and freezing remaining disputed accounts. The judge's language was firm. The documentation raised serious questions of forgery and identity theft. That order slowed the immediate financial threat to the house and forced Kyle and Allison to scramble for alternatives. They turned to desperate measures. Kyle reached out to loan sharks, and Allison made frantic, tearful pleas to old friends. Those outreach efforts generated more evidence: recorded voicemails begging for cash, bank transfer receipts from accounts registered in Kyle's aliases, and text messages showing coordination of deceit. The more they tried to hide, the more holes they exposed in their fabrications. James approached revenge with precision, not vindictiveness. He wanted consequences that matched the crime: humiliation for the charade, financial accountability, and the restoration of his dignity. He avoided vindictive acts that could reflect poorly on him or jeopardize the case. Any attempt at personal retribution could have been twisted into provocation. He refused to give Kyle that weapon. Instead, he let the law dismantle them. Public exposure had its own power. When the local media covered a preliminary hearing, pictures of Allison's tear-streaked face and Kyle's defiant scowl circulated online. Unlike the pity he feared, James found compassion and support. Readers who followed the story messaged him, bringing forward names, documents, and leads he'd overlooked. A woman who ran a veterans group remembered Kyle from a fundraising event where he'd promised a matching donation that never came. Her email provided another piece of paper evidence. The house itself became another front in the campaign. Because Allison and Kyle had tried to claim occupancy and use residency as leverage, James worked with his attorney to secure a civil injunction that legally recognized his ownership and barred them from the premises. The sheriff's office served the order. When Allison attempted to return to collect belongings, she was turned away. That was a quiet revenge, simple, paper-based, and utterly final. It stripped her of the pretense of belonging. At the same time, Rachel's office kept pressing criminal charges. The bench warrant for identity theft described a complex scheme: forged signatures on credit accounts, use of James's social security number to open lines of credit at brick-and-mortar casinos, and falsified applications for markers that allowed extension of credit. Assault charges for the coffee incident were layered alongside attempted extortion counts for the demand to pay $400,000. Together, the charges formed a mosaic too ugly to ignore. When the grand jury convened, the weight of evidence persuaded them to indict both suspects on multiple counts. To James, the indictment felt like the long-awaited confirmation that truth mattered. Yet he also understood the indictment was not the same as final justice. Trials could be messy, delays inevitable, but the indictment ensured the public record matched reality. Meanwhile, the civil suits progressed. Creditors who had been convinced by Kyle's forged paperwork attempted to press claims, but with prosecutors and forensic accounts involved, most reversed their positions or accepted settlements that avoided further liability. A few unscrupulous lenders tried to push back, but with a bank and prosecutor demanding documentation and forensic evidence, they dwindled. Kyle's world collapsed more visibly than Allison's. With his credit gutted and the litigation piling up, his car was repossessed, his phone service canceled, and eviction notices accumulated at a small rental where he tried to lay low. He took to begging for work he could not get. Allison, stripped of her job, her shelter, and the sympathetic facade she'd used, found herself on probation terms and court-ordered restitution schedules after plea negotiations. The restitution amount ordered by the court was a far cry from the $400,000 they tried to force onto James. But it would be a formal recognition of debt for their actions and symbolically acknowledge the damage they'd done. Yet the most satisfying turns came in the quiet, bureaucratic ways that hurt pride. Letters from old friends that once contained wedding invitations now returned undelivered. Community boards removed Allison's business recommendations. Neighbors who had once attended her baby shower avoided her at the grocery store. Kyle, who thrived on the illusion of influence, found himself invisible. James watched these consequences unfold with a tempered heart. He did not take pleasure in his daughter's shame. His revenge was not catharsis through cruelty. Rather, it was rectification. He wanted a public record that held people accountable for violation of the law, and the systems he learned to use, banks, courts, newspapers, did precisely that when he used them relentlessly and intelligently. By the time the preliminary hearings wrapped and plea negotiations began, the $400,000 figure had achieved its function. It had exposed the depth of deception, rallied a legal response, and catalyzed the disintegration of the con artists' lives. James had not sought ruin for the sake of ruin. He'd sought balance, and the law, operating in its cautious, deliberate way, had delivered. The winter deepened outside the courthouse windows. Inside, James's resolve hardened in a different way. He had stepped into the storm and emerged with his dignity intact. The revenge had been organized, lawful, and thorough, and unraveling executed with patience until the tangled web of lies and theft fell apart of its own weight. And even as the legal process moved forward, James planned the final elements of his comeback, reclaiming his quiet life, repairing the damage to his home, and ultimately, when the trials were done and the signatures on court orders dried, reclaiming the things they had tried to steal, peace and a future unshadowed by betrayal. By early spring, the neighborhood looked different to James. Snow had melted, the grass was beginning to green, and buds pushed stubbornly against branches along the quiet street. Yet for Allison and Kyle, the season brought no renewal. It brought collapse. The court process accelerated. The prosecutor's office had stacked charges high, and though defense attorneys argued manipulation, stress, and family misunderstanding, the paper trail was undeniable. Forged documents with James's name, betting site records in Kyle's accounts, and the photographs of James's scalded chest silenced most excuses. For James, the days blurred into hearings and depositions. He sat through testimony, sometimes numbed by disbelief that his daughter's name appeared in court filings alongside words like fraud and battery. Other times, he clenched his jaw so tight his teeth hurt. Still, he endured. Each court date was a step toward finality. The local newspaper continued following the case. Their coverage framed James as an unlikely fighter, a retired factory worker turned accidental warrior against financial exploitation. The headline in February read, $400,000 forgery scandal, father versus daughter in identity theft case. James never sought the spotlight, but he understood its value. Publicity left Allison and Kyle no room to manipulate quietly. When neighbors read about the court orders, they stopped speculating about James's health or sanity and began speaking openly about Kyle's shady history. At the grocery store, strangers offered sympathy. At the bank, the manager who once doubted him now greeted him with deference. James never gloated, but inside he savored the quiet reversal. The truth no longer lived in shadows. The system hit Kyle first and hardest. Creditors hounded him relentlessly. With the fraud investigations ongoing, none of his accounts held water. His car was repossessed, his phone disconnected. Eviction notices plastered his rental unit door. Worse, the criminal trial for his earlier fraudulent checks came due. Already under a new set of charges for the Whitaker case, Kyle faced the judge with a record that screamed career scammer. The prosecutor painted a damning picture: years of manipulation, unpaid debts, a pattern of deceit culminating in the attempt to pin $400,000 of gambling losses on his father-in-law. The judge did not flinch. Kyle was sentenced to 8 months in county jail for the fraud conviction, with more time pending depending on the outcome of the identity theft case. He left the courtroom in handcuffs, jaw tight, shouting accusations at James. "You did this! You ruined us! You'll pay, Whitaker!" James sat silently, hands folded. He knew Kyle's words carried no weight anymore. The man's world had already crumbled. Allison's case unfolded differently. Her attorney argued she was a victim of Kyle's influence, manipulated by a husband she trusted. They painted her as desperate, torn between loyalty to her father and loyalty to her marriage. But Rachel Porter, the ADA, countered with precision. She played recordings of Allison's phone calls, read aloud text messages where Allison discussed hiding documents, and presented James's testimony about the coffee attack. The image of Allison as innocent pawn evaporated. In March, Judge Catherine Miller handed down her ruling. Allison would not serve jail time, but would face 18 months of probation, mandatory counseling, community service, and restitution payments. She was also issued a permanent restraining order. She could not approach James or contact him directly for the foreseeable future. As the words were read, Allison's face crumpled. Her sobs echoed in the courtroom. Her pleas, "Daddy, please, I'm sorry, I didn't mean it," met with James's steady silence. He did not rise. He didn't comfort. He let the system do what it had never done before: hold her accountable. The court ordered Allison to pay James $15,000 in restitution, a recognition of the documented damages and his legal expenses. The amount was symbolic compared to the $400,000 they had tried to saddle him with, but to James it represented something more profound: acknowledgement. Every month for the next 5 years, a check would arrive from the daughter who once conspired to steal his home. It would be small, but it would be steady, and each payment would remind her of the bridge she had burned. James did not celebrate. He only thought, "She tried to rob me of peace. Now her own peace is gone." The arrests and trials had turned into the talk of the suburb. At first, neighbors had whispered cautiously, but after the newspaper coverage, people stopped him on walks, offered casseroles, shook his hand. "You showed strength," one woman said, her eyes kind. "I hope I'd have the courage if I were in your shoes." James thanked them politely, though he never sought admiration. He didn't feel brave. He felt tired. Yet the acknowledgement mattered. For years, Kyle had subtly turned Allison against him, gaslit him, made him doubt his own memory. Now the community affirmed what James had always known deep down: he wasn't crazy. He wasn't the problem. They were. Despite the restraining order, Allison tried to reach him. First came letters, handwritten in careful script, pleading for forgiveness. "I was scared, Dad. I didn't know what to do. Please give me another chance." James never replied. He placed the letters in a file folder labeled evidence. One morning in April, Frank found a bouquet of daisies on James's porch, Allison's favorite childhood flowers. James lifted them gently, smelt their sweetness, then walked to the garbage bin and dropped them inside. He didn't hesitate. Some things could not be patched with flowers. From jail, Kyle's life deteriorated further. Court documents revealed the IRS had launched an audit into unreported gambling winnings. Loan sharks circulated threatening messages, more evidence now logged with investigators. His name became radioactive. No employer would consider him, no friend would stand by him. James read updates with a mix of grim satisfaction and sorrow. He never wished death on Kyle. But to see justice strip away the man's arrogance, it was enough. In the shelter of Frank's kitchen, James admitted it one evening. "I don't want him dead. I just want him irrelevant, forgotten, no longer able to hurt anyone." Frank nodded, raising his glass. "That's the best revenge, Jim. Not rage, not vengeance. Oblivion." By late May, the final hearings concluded. Kyle received additional sentencing for the identity theft case, another 6 months, served consecutively with his earlier conviction. Allison's probation terms were extended after she violated the restraining order twice by appearing at James's house. The courtroom closed with finality. For the first time in years, James walked out of the courthouse lighter, as though the weight strapped to his shoulders had finally been cut loose. Revenge, James realized, didn't arrive in a single fiery climax. It unfolded in slow, deliberate strokes. The arrests, the headlines, the frozen accounts, the restitution orders. Each step dismantled the illusion that Allison and Kyle had built. By summer, their lives were rubble. Kyle, still in jail, faced more lawsuits than he could count. Allison, stripped of her job and reputation, shuffled between probation appointments and court-ordered therapy sessions. James, meanwhile, restored his home. He repainted the spare bedroom where they once stayed, installed fresh locks, and replaced furniture they had ruined. Each nail hammered, each brushstroke felt like reclaiming space from ghosts. The final touch was his garden. He replanted roses Margaret once loved, pulled weeds, laid fresh mulch. He told Frank, "If I can make this soil bloom again, I can make myself bloom too." And bloom it did. By August, roses stretched in vibrant red against the fence line, a quiet declaration of endurance. On his porch one evening, James considered everything that had happened. Revenge hadn't made him joyful. It hadn't healed every wound. But it had restored balance. The people who tried to brand him a senile gambler, who hurled scalding coffee at his chest, who demanded $400,000 he never owed, those people were paying their price. And he, James Whitaker, still stood. He whispered to the quiet street, "That's enough." Summer in Ohio had always carried a kind of golden quiet. Long evenings, cicadas humming, the faint smell of barbecue drifting from porches. For James Whitaker, that season felt different now, not just because of the warmth, but because of the peace it carried. The trials were over. Kyle was locked away, serving out his sentence with more charges looming on the horizon. Allison, bound by probation and restitution, had faded into the background of James's life. She was a presence only in the form of occasional checks mailed by the court system, stiff little envelopes that arrived each month like a reminder of choices made and consequences owed. James no longer trembled when the mail came, no longer feared the phone's ring. His life was his own again. The house, once poisoned by tension, had regained its heart. James painted the walls fresh white, replaced the scuffed carpet with hardwood floors, and repaired the broken cabinet handles that Kyle had yanked loose years ago. On weekends, Frank came over with tools, and together they rebuilt the porch swing. Sitting on it one Saturday evening, James let the creak of the chains carry him back to better days. Margaret's laughter, Allison's childhood giggles. Those memories still hurt, but they no longer broke him. They felt like treasures instead of weapons. James also returned to habits he had neglected. He dusted off his fishing rods, drove out to the lake at dawn, and let the stillness settle him. He started writing again, keeping a journal not of pain, but of reflections, lessons learned about trust, resilience, and the true meaning of family. And he began volunteering at a community center, quietly helping other retirees navigate financial scams. "If I can save just one person from what happened to me," he told Frank, "then all of this won't have been wasted." The center director often introduced him as the man who fought back and won. James only smiled humbly, but inside he felt proud. His revenge had become more than personal, it had become a shield for others. Sometimes, late at night, guilt still stirred in him. The thought of Allison as a little girl, riding on his shoulders at the county fair, whispering secrets about what prizes she wanted to win. He would stare at the ceiling, wondering if there had been a moment, some choice, some lesson missed that had set her on the path to betrayal. But each time the doubt clawed, he reminded himself, she made her choices, I made mine. He had chosen survival, justice, dignity. She had chosen deceit. And so the balance remained. By the end of that year, James sat once more in his garden, roses blooming in Margaret's honor. He sipped iced tea, the evening breeze brushing cool across his face. The house was quiet, safe, his again. His enemies had tried to brand him as a desperate old man, bury him under $400,000 of lies. Instead, they had been unmasked, dismantled, and left to live in the ruins of their own decisions. James Whittaker leaned back in his chair, the scent of roses around him, and let himself smile. Revenge, he realized, wasn't about destroying others. It was about refusing to let them destroy you. And in that quiet summer evening, with his home whole and his spirit unbroken, James had his answer. He had won.